As we look at that passage this morning, we'll be looking mainly at those first two stories. And there is a similarity, and as Luke is writing, not everything in the gospel records are chronological in order. But many times they take stories that are similar and lump them together because they're not displaying a chronological logbook of Jesus' life. Each one of them are trying to describe who Jesus is and why he came. At the end there in verse 11, it mentions that those religious leaders were in rage. They were very angry, furious, and they were looking at what they could do to Jesus. In one sense, I mean, he hadn't even called the 12. Now, he had called Simon and Andrew and James and John, and he had called Levi, but he made it official just after this. Called the 12 out of many other disciples. So he narrowed it down to the 12 who would be the closest to him. But what was all that took place? What Jesus did on the Sabbath day. Now, I am going to just jump right in, and I am going to ask a question that may cause a little tension at first, may kind of ruffle some feathers, and it may cause you to swing one way or the other, or kind of find out where you are. And if, in one sense, if you were to draw a line from over here to over here, where would you land? And the question really is, are you more concerned about guarding and protecting the commandments given by God, or guarding and protecting the people created by God? I think there is just below the verse, you can put that up and so people can kind of see it visually. But think about that for a moment. Are you more concerned about guarding and protecting the commandments given by God, or guarding and protecting the people created by God in His image? Now, there are some people, which you could line up right with the Pharisees, who their entire mission is to guard and protect the commandments of God and never give a thought about guarding and protecting the people that God has created. Now, there are others that try to relieve and move out of the way the commandments of God and only try to protect the people. But the true, when you think about that, kind of which way do we go? And I hope somewhere we're kind of in the middle. Because to be honest, we cannot do the one without the other. Because if we have a clear understanding of the commandments that God has given to us, the entire purpose God has given us commands is for the protection of the people, to benefit people. And we could go down through the whole list of the 10 Commandments. Where you could go back on YouTube. I believe about 2 years ago, I preached through the 10 Commandments, and I called it, don't break the, and I had rules crossed out, and I had relationships below. The entire purpose of the commandments are to protect people, to protect relationships. But there are some, and you may have met some, where their entire purpose, they see the commandments of God and they focus only on the commandments of God, and in the end begin hurting people along the way. And that is exactly what was taking place here. As we look into this passage in chapter 6, we'll look at the life of Jesus. But you know, when we stop and think about the commandments God has given, some people have the idea that God just likes to make rules and commandments just to discern who's good and who's not, who's worthy, who's not, who's superior, who's not. That wasn't why God gave commandments. Some people think that God has given a lot of commands just to be in power. But that wasn't the case either. In fact, when God created humanity, He only gave one command. have you ever been in a school, a business, an organization, whatever it might be, and when it started off, there really weren't very many rules. But over time, that rule book continues to grow. Sometimes you can even write names along by the side of it. In fact, when I went to Bible college, there was a rule in the rule book that you were not allowed to use inline skates on the campus. Now you may think, I knew Bible colleges were pretty strict, but inline skates? What's wrong with that? Now when I arrived, it was the very first time the rule had ever been in the rule book. And you could write my sister's name next to it. Because the previous year, she had come down the driveway or the parking lot, down a hill, couldn't make the turn, couldn't stop on her inline skates, and ran right into the side of a car. One knee into the fender, one knee into the door, and her stomach caught the mirror. She actually did $1,500 worth of damage to the car, and this was over 20 years ago. So they just put the rule, no inline skates on campus. And many times, whether it's protection of the property, whether it's protection for the people, they actually made her go to the hospital just in case she had internal bleeding. But in one sense, when you go throughout the Word of God, God has given commandments for the protection of individuals. Aren't you thankful we still have laws about stealing and killing? It'd be nice if there was more laws about lying or coveting or honoring parents, because wouldn't that create a better society? There's not very many laws about adultery anymore, but would you want your spouse to commit adultery? No, we want those. But so when we stop and think about each command, they are for the benefit of relationships. And as we look into this passage, it starts off, Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field of grain. We don't know whether it was barley, wheat, whatever it might have been. And it's on the Sabbath day, and it points out specifically the disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing it in their hands. Now, when we read through this, we might think, well, what's the big deal? Really, we would almost say they're walking through somebody else's field and they're picking the crops and eating it. We would look at it as stealing, but that was allowed then. You couldn't take a bushel basket off the property, but you could eat what was there while you're passing through. If you're passing through an orchard and you're hungry, you could pick an apple and eat it while you're walking through. But you weren't allowed to take some out. But as these Pharisees looked on, they said, whoa. Your disciples are breaking the Sabbath because God has said you cannot work on the Sabbath day. But what they were doing is they were not breaking the Sabbath day according to God's word. Many years prior, there was a great synagogue, a great council that had met together, and they had come up with what was determined as work on the Sabbath day. And they had come up with 39 provisions, which included reaping and threshing. And as you looked at the disciples, as they picked, that was reaping. As they rubbed the corn together, that was threshing, or the grain. Also, as they disposed of the chaff, that was winnowing. And as they ate the grain, that would have meant they would have prepared the food. That would have been 4 infractions against, the laws that the men had made. No wonder they were so angry at Jesus and his disciples. And it doesn't mention that Jesus did it, but his disciples did it. And so Jesus, being the rabbi, Jesus being the teacher, and didn't stop it, Jesus was to be accused. And how often do we try to jump onto things and accuse people? But Jesus responds here. He says, have you not even read this? What David did when he was hungry? Now, he's not trying to justify what he's doing, but he's pointing out their inconsistencies. And it's interesting how he puts it. Have you not even read? Well, of course they had read. They were masters of the Old Testament. They were masters of the Hebrew Scriptures. They knew everything about David. He was their hero king. And he says, haven't you ever read this? When David was hungry, and he and those who were with him, how he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those with him, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he said to them, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. He says, haven't you read about David? You're not out to accuse him, but he did what was unlawful. But yet as he was the anointed by God to be the king, he was running for his life. The priest gave him what was only designated for the priest. Now, if you were to read in Matthew and Mark, Matthew, Jesus expounds even further. It says, or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? Have you never considered that the priests are working every single Sabbath day as they do the service of the Lord? They're profaning the Sabbath, but yet you don't speak against them. And in this statement, as he says, I, the Son of Man, is the Lord of the Sabbath. As these disciples are doing the work for the Lord, are they not allowed to do that? But then also, Mark points out another statement that Jesus had made. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Bringing out the entire purpose of why the Sabbath was even given to them. The Sabbath was to bless individuals. And to be honest, no, we aren't necessarily under the law to follow the Sabbath in the way that it was in the Old Testament. But it's interesting, over the last decade or so, how many books are written about rest. Because we live in a society that we don't know how to stop and rest. I've got several books. Art of Rest. There were several others I thought about, almost like a stack of just how important, refresh, relax, different books speaking about the importance and the reason why God has given us the Sabbath day for rest. Not to become a burden onto people. But then Luke continues right on into another story on the Sabbath. Kind of brings it more to a head. It says, now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find accusation. Think about this. As they're sitting around, they're hearing Jesus teach. They look across to the other side. They see this man has a withered hand. They know Jesus in his compassion, but they also know it's the Sabbath. And it's almost as though they almost have a desire for Jesus to heal, not for the man's sake, but so that they could find accusation. I gotcha. You can't get out of this one. And it reveals so much within the heart of these men. And it goes on, but he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, arise and stand here. Jesus could have healed the man just with the thought in his head, and silently the man's hand could have been perfectly healed. But Jesus wanted to teach not only with his words, but he wanted to teach with his actions. And he wanted to make a display, a public example of God's heart for people. And he has the man stand up, come up in the midst, so that everybody can see you. Not just the Pharisees who see your withered hand, but everybody in the crowd. They can see your hand. And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath day? Is it lawful to do these things? Now, according to their laws, they had made up, if it was life-threatening, then you could deal with it. But if it could wait till tomorrow, then it must wait till tomorrow. And in their eyes, they said, well, this could wait till tomorrow. We don't know how long he's had this withered hand. But in Jesus' mind, it's almost as though, why wait? Once again, God did not give the Sabbath. God gave the Sabbath so that man's hands could have a day of rest. But he did not give the Sabbath so that a man's hand would continue to stay withered for another day. Now, in Matthew, as you look at this story, Matthew adds in a few more words that Jesus said. He said, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? He says, if you had a lamb and it fell in a pit, it couldn't get out, would you wait until the next day? Would you just wait around and knowing it's there, or would you go and get that lamb out, even though it's the Sabbath? And he knew their response. He knew their thoughts. They would have gone out and taken that lamb out. And Jesus continues on. He says, of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And they were enraged. Because as they were looking for an opportunity to accuse him, he put them on the spot and turned the tables, if you will. But it all comes back to what God has said and why he has said it. And as I ask that question, are you more concerned about guarding and protecting the commandments given by God, or guarding and protecting the people created by God in his image? These Pharisees were so concentrated on guarding and protecting God's law, God's commandments, that they failed to recognize protecting and guarding God's people. David Gooding wrote in his commentary according to Luke, he says, the religious mind is a curious thing. It is not necessarily interested in common morality, still less in relieving human misery and affliction. It is interested in keeping rules, particularly the rules which spring from its own cherished interpretations of Scripture or tradition. These interpretations it will attribute the inflexible authority of God himself. Stop and think about that. When we are focused solely on, well, as he points out, he calls it the religious mind. Focuses solely on the rules. Make sure we follow the rules. Every jot, every tittle, to the hurt of people. And to be honest, if we've been in church for a long time, we have probably either felt it or we have seen it happen. We have seen how people use things. And what happens if we get so focused on protecting and guarding the commandments and neglecting and not even thinking about protecting and thinking about the people, what will happen is we may keep certain commandments, but we'll destroy other commandments. Remember when Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was? He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And the second one is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And what he's doing is, you cannot do the one without the other. And these Pharisees thought they were doing everything to protect and guard and do everything right in God's eyes by following the commandments. But in the meantime, they were not loving their neighbor. And although they thought they were doing the one, by not doing the other, they were not doing the first. So while they focused so solely on the one, they ended up breaking them all. And that really is, when we stop and think about grace and truth, when we stop and think about guarding and protecting the commandments of God, you could say is truth. And guarding and protecting the people of God is the grace. And when both of them come together, Jesus was full of grace and truth. As Jesus pointed out, the Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. The commandments were given to benefit man and to protect men and relationships, not man for the commandments. And you know, as we look at this, it rubbed those religious leaders so badly. They were so upset. But what Jesus was pointing out is God's love for people. And the commandments that he has given, this was not a moral commandment. This was really a ceremonial and really a designated for the people for that rest and reflection toward God. But these men had used it as leverage against the people. And one of the things that I mentioned in our members meeting last week, and kind of here in the church, I mentioned about certain things that we value because we see that Jesus values them. And one of the things is people over policy. And just kind of go through the 5 things: people over policy, people over practices, people over property, people over programs, people over projects. And what I mean by that, here you might have had policy. These men had put in policies in place so that the laws of God were not broken, but while those policies, not the commandments of God, those policies to protect the commandments actually started hurting the people. And they lifted up the policy over the people. When I mentioned people over practices or traditions, Mark chapter 7, the Pharisees were out to get the disciples because they didn't wash their hands. And tradition says that you needed to wash your hands. Not just mama, but tradition says you have to wash your hands. But once again, Jesus pointed out that they had elevated their traditions over the commandments of God. And while they were following their traditions, they were not following the commandments of honoring their parents. People over property. If you were to go back to Luke chapter 5, when people busted up the roof to get a paralyzed man through, Jesus cared more about that paralyzed man than he did about the roof. How much do we care about people more than this building? If somebody spills on the carpet, it's all right. We care about people more than the property. That's why we bought a carpet cleaner, so we can get on it and clean the carpet, right? People over programs, ministries. Although the ministries are to reach people, but they should never get in the way of reaching people. In fact, lowering the man through the roof, that was a disruption of Jesus' teaching. But then later on in Luke chapter 18, as Jesus is teaching and preaching is important, and all of a sudden, parents started bringing children to Jesus and wanted Jesus to bless their children. And the disciples said, whoa. Not having it. Jesus has more important things to do. He's teaching maybe hundreds of people. And you want to bring your children in the middle of this? What did Jesus do? No. Let the little children come to me. Forbid them not. For of such is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus did more teaching than just with his words. He did it through his display of actions. He was willing and ready to stop all of his teaching for a moment to bless these children. And people over projects. Every project that we do ought to be to reach people. In fact, when you go to Luke chapter 15, or Acts chapter 15, and you find the council meeting together, the apostles and the Jews coming together, and do the Gentiles need to be circumcised and follow the laws of Moses in order to be a follower of Jesus? And there was a debate going back and forth. What should we do? Well, for the Gentiles' gratitude, it wasn't a mandatory thing for the men to be circumcised. We would need more than just a baptism pool underneath here. We would need a surgical room in the back. But they said that is not necessary in order to be a follower of Jesus. In fact, in Acts chapter 15, verse 19, it says, "Therefore I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God." Now, the way the NIV puts it, it says, "It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God." When I stop and think about that, and you think about these Pharisees, and they wanted to elevate and raise up certain things so high that really they were hurting people, and at other times elevating certain things so high that they were pushing away or turning away people. No, Jesus came for people. Jesus died for people. Because we've broken the commandments, Jesus came so that we could have forgiveness and have a renewed relationship with him. But as I stop and think about this, I have to search my heart. Because is there times where I can get so focused on maybe policy, practices, programs, property, that I fail to see people who Jesus died for, who Jesus loves? And it can be so easy to start guarding and protecting the commandments of God so tightly that we fail to recognize that these commandments that God has given was actually in place to protect people. So if we focus so solely on the one and we start hurting people, then we need to go back and recognize what was the whole purpose of God giving these commandments. And so as we consider this is not downplaying the commandments of God. In fact, it is raising them up and giving a clear understanding of why God has given them, not our distorted interpretations of them. And Jesus brings it back, and he points out, you value sheep, I value people. You value the Sabbath or the policies that you display on the Sabbath, I value people. Jesus came for people. Jesus came for me. Jesus came for you, so that we could find forgiveness, so that we could have a relationship with him.